Okay, thank you. Sorry for the short delay. We had minor technical difficulties, but it's all working now. So, hello. The next topic of the presentation is threat modeling report from the trenches. This is about me. Very quickly, my name is Mateusz. I've been working as a software developer for quite some time, but 4 years ago, I decided to slowly move toward application security part of the field. And right now, my position is application security engineer in Ocado Technology. So I am part of the team, the AppSec team, which Tomek was previously mentioning. We're working together on the password migration case. I mostly deal with web technologies just because I need to help our developers, and we are doing mostly web-based stuff. All right. So about this presentation, that's not completely true. That I have no idea what I'm doing, and I know nothing about threat modeling. But I would like to say from the beginning that I am no like oracle when it comes to threat modeling. The point of this presentation is to share our approach to this and challenges we had along the line and so on. And I am very much open to the discussion. If you have some experiences which contradict our thoughts on our results, then I will be more than happy to hear them. So keep that in mind, that I'm not presenting the one and only way. And yeah, and the kind of main point of this presentation is that a while ago, when we started doing this in Ocado, it turned out that it's not that simple, meaning there was a lot of theory on how to do this, but apparently not many people are doing threat modeling. And because of that, in theory, we knew everything, but in practice, we had some challenges, some problems, and so on. And I thought that sharing them would be quite interesting. Quick agenda. So first, we will say what is actually threat modeling, then why you do want to do threat modeling, then how you could do this, and finally, if it's worth the effort. And apparently, as you can see, I am a kind of a slide genius because that's a great slide. But that's basically the agenda. So yeah. Okay, what is threat modeling? This is not the threat modeling I'm going to talk about. And this is also not the threat modeling I'm going to be talking about. And you'd be surprised how often it gets confused when I talk to developers. So I will be talking about threats with the T at the end. My English pronunciation is not that great, so I very often get confused. We are talking about threats to our applications. And I'd like to know how many of you actually heard anything about threat modeling. Please raise your hand. All right, a little bit. And how many of you actually took part in threat modeling process before? Okay, 3-4 persons. And how many of you do this like regularly? Okay. Yeah, so great. Maybe we'll all learn something today. So the general idea of threat modeling, and by the way, I won't be giving you like the exact definitions of all the things I will be talking about. I thought about it, but I don't really know them that well myself. So if you are like a purist, like definition purist, then I'm sorry, because it will be a little painful. But in my opinion, like the idea is more important. So the general idea is to model your threats, which is kind of not very much telling. But basically, creating a model of your threats means coming up with all possible things which could go wrong in your applications. Actually, threat model is per application. So in this in the particular application, you are threat modeling at the moment. So, for example, who could attack you? What could they do to you? And so on and so on. This sounds easy enough. This isn't, though, like an exact science. So there is quite a lot of things around threat modeling which are happening as well at the same time, even though they are not necessarily the threat modeling. I mean, they're not necessarily exactly around threat modeling. So first of all, you will need to get familiar with documentation, or maybe create your documentation. You will need to, for example, assess your assets, assess the risks which are like tied to the threats we will be modeling, and so on. But that's not important. If you call it threat modeling, that's a threat modeling, and what matters is the outcome. So if you do this with, for example, enumerating vulnerabilities or not, that doesn't really matter that much. And that's basically it. I mean, the concept is pretty straightforward, but the details are more complicated. So, but maybe before we talk about details, I would need to know why we are huge supporters of threat modeling, and personally, I myself am. So, okay, imagine this. Okay, this is lagging, unfortunately, but imagine you have been just appointed as a head of security in your company, of application security. So you're responsible for security of the product you're creating. What would you do? You don't need to say it out loud, but think about it for a little bit. And I would say that you might have some good ideas or maybe bad ideas, but a lot of people do something like this because everything seems like super fun and super important to do, and so on. So you just heard at the conference about this new dust tool, which supposedly makes you super secure. So you want to implement this, but at the same time, you read this great article about homomorphic encryption, and you want to implement in your database. And there's like tons of great ideas of what you could do to increase the level of security of your company, but it's not that simple to do everything at once. So actually, what you need to not do is being a headless chicken. This is, by the way, how I kind of explain this to myself, that I don't want application security in Ocado to behave like a headless chicken who is running around without the purpose. And by the way, as you maybe noticed, I didn't include a GIF. I included the GIF of Home Alone before. Do not Google for headless chicken. Especially do not Google image search for headless chicken. Results are disturbing, and I'm sorry I did that right now. So yeah, but nevertheless, this is how I kind of explain this to myself, right? Do not run around without the purpose. Find the purpose. Actually, find the plan. You need to plan what you will focus on first, what you will focus on second, and next, and so on and so on. And in order to come up with this plan, you should probably, ideally, know the answer to these three very important questions. First of them is, why do you want to be secure? And you might be a little bit surprised that I'm supposed to be the security guy who is standing here and asking these questions, because a lot of people would probably scoff and say that, because you want to be secure, it's security after all, or security is so important, and so on. Well, probably because I have a development background, I tend to look at things differently. And in my opinion, if someone thinks that you are stupid for asking this question, why do you want to be secure, then you need to write from him, because he's just a zealot who thinks only about security, and he doesn't recognize the fact that products are not about security. I mean, maybe security applications are, but most of them are not. So I really like one of the stories from the time when I was studying at the uni. It was obviously quite a while ago. We had this lab, and we were supposed to do some Java coding. And a friend of mine opened like a text editor and typed the class name, and then sit like this. And the lecturer came to us, and he said, "Congratulations, you have 0 bugs." And that's true, right? That this is the only part of your coding when you actually are not creating bugs, if you're not doing anything. Security bugs are also bugs. So the only secure product is product without the functionality. And you need to remember that this is not what products are for. So you probably are aware of the fact that security can hurt usability. And if you put too much security into the product, then people will find workarounds, right? So like the famous post-it notes with passwords on the screens, right? We tend to laugh at them, but that's what people will do. You need to remember that first of all, product must be usable, then it must be secure. If product is not usable, if it lacks functionality, then it's just a bad product. And I, by the way, think that usable security, like domain, as a domain of security, is very much underappreciated. And quite a lot, we in the security community focus too much on the security and forget about the other part. So knowing exactly why you want to be secure is pretty important, because there are valid reasons. Like, for example, maybe it's compliance with the law. Maybe it's because you know that, for example, data breach will hurt your business because people will lose trust in your company. I'm not saying security is not important. I'm saying you need to know why exactly you want security in place. And that's also very important, because the next question is, what does secure mean in your context, right? And I have like GIF or two which present this like perfectly. Because if you think security, you think logs. I mean, even HTTPS have this famous padlock, right? So there, these terms like security and logs are logs is what comes to mind when you think of security. And I have two great examples of logs. So here's a padlock and a gate, and it seems secure enough until you kind of do this, and yeah. So there was a padlock. Everything was working great, but you wouldn't call it secure. And this GIF is great, so I have another one. This one is also great. You again have some kind of lock, and yeah. So the point is that security doesn't have simple definition, and security of your product depends on your product, because maybe what you care about is data that you store. Maybe it's kind of a business model of your company. For example, there is this tendency to always think of remote code execution as the most terrible thing that could happen to you. And I'm not saying it's great if someone gains access to your server, but depending on the context, this might not be a case. So another example is, a lot of people would think that if you have e-commerce site, then like the most problematic thing that could happen to you if someone would somehow steal your money. For example, it would be able to buy a product and then pay less than he should, right? So this is what most people think of. Well, that's not actually true. The most important thing you care about is actually availability, because most retailers have some kind of fraud protections, and you can sometimes circumvent them a little bit, so you will like make them lose like $1,000 or $10,000 or something like this. But this is very small money they are losing comparing to 5 minutes of outage. 5 minutes of outage is, for example, not getting paid by customers and possibly losing customers for life. So denial of service attacks, which tend to be kind of ignored because it's what scripted kiddies do, are actually very much a problem. And you need to answer yourself what you actually care about in terms of security for your product. Okay, so step 1, step 2, now step 3. You know why you want to be secure. You know what does it mean in your context. But what would you do? I mean, have you talked recently to your product owners? That's how they look. This is a typical product owner maintaining his backlog. And have you talked to your developers? This is actually what they do. I mean, as I said, this is a bit nagging, but I think you get the point. This is also what they do, and the point is they're pretty busy. You can't just expect that you will come to them and you will say that I have like extra week of tasks for you to do, and they will be like, yay. That's not gonna happen. Everybody is busy. Everybody. I mean, like the product owners are getting bombarded from all the sides because UX team wants something, and for example, performance team wants something, and security team wants something, and the business wants something, and the business is the most important part. Remember, because product is what matters. And we can't really like stop developing new features for next year and do only security. All right, so what's the solution? You need to like do things slowly, meaning introduce, for example, some security feature every now and then, and eventually get to the point where you are quite secure. But you can't really expect to do everything today. So that's pretty much it. And also, if you are prioritizing, you should get the ROI. And I'm sorry, I'm using ROI. It's one of the probably most overused acronyms out there. But I think you get the point. So if you have a security feature which will greatly benefit your security, but it's very cheap to do for developers and so on, then you should do this like as soon as possible. But if you have like security feature which will take a month and actually the security benefit is minuscule, then maybe you could just ignore it. And maybe you think it's kind of a blasphemy again from me as a security guy to say ignore security features, but that's how it works, right? You need to ignore some things in order to do some more important things, and you need to keep that in mind. I think that all of these are pretty reasonable things which aren't really like a revelation to you, right? But people tend to forget about this. So that's why I'm mentioning this. And two bonus things which you get from threat modeling, which are not really the point, but you will get this as a benefit. So this is a rebus for you. Any ideas what this is? Like in the red circle? That's a security patch. Obviously, not always. I mean, there are some decent patches and so on. But sometimes, if you, for example, have design flaws or things like this, it is possible to kind of not be able to really fix the issue. And if you do threat modeling from the beginning of developing your product, then you have a great chance of avoiding this kind of problem. And also another bonus is documentation. So threat modeling helps you to create some kind of documentation. And if you are thinking that the image here would be like tons of papers and so on, yeah, right. Your documentation is probably non-existent. And if it does exist, it's like 2 years old. and so on. And doing like real threat modeling without any documentation is close to impossible. So as a benefit, you will also have some kind of the documentation afterwards. All right, so the third part is how. And yeah. First step. But okay, so there's like a general approach, and then you could achieve this result in many ways. But the general approach is more or less always like this. First is, well, draw. It doesn't exactly mean draw, but you need to create this documentation I was just talking about. The best thing you could base your threat model on is some kind of system diagram. So that's why it says draw, because you need to draw the diagram. If you have one, that's great. This is not really a part of threat modeling, but it's like a necessary thing to have before moving further on. And this is, for example, how this kind of diagram would look like. I'm not going to focus on this one, on this right now, because I will focus on it later. And then the real first step of threat modeling is to collect threats. Okay, so now a little bit of definitions, but again, these are not like very strict definitions. What is threat? What is vulnerability? What is attack? What is mitigation? So threat is a potential thing that could happen to your application. So the example, if you are using SQL database, your threat is SQL injection. It doesn't mean if you are using SQL correctly and you don't have SQL injection vulnerability, but because somewhere along the line, you could forget about correct usage in one particular point. So you always have this threat of SQL injection if you are using SQL. So vulnerability is a concrete example of threats which kind of happened, right? So if you actually find a place when you can do SQL injection, this is a vulnerability. And attack is just using this vulnerability. This is pretty enough. And mitigation is an action which is supposed to either lower the threat or completely eliminate or lower the chances of exploiting of vulnerability, which is attack. And you need to create a list of threats. This is probably where most of threat modeling processes out there differ, but the outcome of all of them is a list of threats. And then, once you have this list, you need to assess these threats. So assessment consists of mostly three parts. First is what is the risk associated with the threat? The second one is, are we actually vulnerable to this threat right now? Is it just a threat or maybe a vulnerability? And the third part would be, what should we do about this, if anything? So again, like talking about all of these points a little bit more. First of all, quantify the risk. So you need to know the risk. And there's like a lot of ways on how to calculate risk, and I'm not really like a super specialist in risk and so on. This is mostly for management, but you need to have some kind of risk modeling like concept or way. And when you're talking about the risk, the main points to focus are implications, like impact of the threat of vulnerability. So how bad this threat is to you, like potentially, and the likelihood, which is how likely this threat would happen. And you could then, for example, use something called dread score, but actually maybe you could just use like oversimplified almost thing, which is just multiplying your impact and your likelihood at getting the risk score. And obviously higher is worse because it means the likelihood is higher and the impact is also higher. Right, then assess your situation. So again, are you actually vulnerable to the threat? Because if you are, you probably want to fix this, or maybe not. but that changes kind of the discussion, right? If so, what could be the fix? Usually there's more than one way. So I don't know, SQL injection. You could like use better framework, or maybe do query sanitization by yourself, and so on. You need to know what are your options. If this is not a vulnerability to you, if it's just a threat, then maybe you still would like to introduce some extra defense in-depth controls, which will help you to not learn after some time that this threat actually became a vulnerability. You want to have some other controls on top of it. But that's actually step 2.3, agree on actions. So again, you have a list of things you could do. You know how serious they are. Now is the time to decide what actually to do and what not, because we can accept the risk. This is a magical term, which means just ignore this. And I know that, but it is not a bad thing. Again, you need to prioritize your work, and sometimes ignoring one risk in order to do something else, which is far more important, is just better. And if you do want to do something about the problem, then maybe you have a solution A, which is costly and fixes 100% of the issue, and maybe solution B, which is very cheap and fixes 90% of the issue. And you need to know which one you would want to use, because again, it's all about like business cost of the thing, right? And okay, so this is like step +1, because again, it's not a threat modeling. But if you just did threat modeling, and it takes time to do threat modeling, and you would just ignore the results, then you just wasted your time. So remember to act afterwards, because I mean, if you won't act, it's just a process, and nobody cares about just the processes. Okay, so but actually, how you do this threat modeling? Unfortunately, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. And this is probably something you've noticed if you did some research on threat modeling. So this is what I noticed a while ago, that you can't really find a single one resource where you can learn all about threat modeling and be like, yeah, now I know everything, and I will just introduce it in my company. And I will be talking mostly about one solution, the one we choose to do in Ocado, and we'll mention briefly some very popular other ones, just for you to know that maybe these are the ways you would prefer. I'm not saying our way is the best way. And yeah, kind of the problem here, again, is I've already mentioned that, but there are no actual real life examples. Everybody's just saying about you should do threat modeling, and this is about, I don't know, collecting assets and identifying threats and so on. But I really couldn't find a great example of how actually you do this on the with the live system. And you might remember this guy. You might think that Microsoft is evil and stuff, but actually they were the guys who started this threat modeling initiatives back in around 2002. There was this like very famous memo from Bill Gates that we really do need to care about security, and they started doing threat models, and they were huge supporters of threat models, and that's why the first approach, the most common, I would say, approach is I'm calling it traditional. It's kind of a Microsoft or OWASP as well approach, which is mostly focused on lots of lists. So you are first creating assets list, then the threat list, then vulnerabilities list, and so on and so on and so on. You use like pre-prepared list and also a little bit of brainstorming, and great. And right, but people tend to not like lists, for example, me included. So obviously, there are applications which were designed to help you do threat model. And okay, so I need to stress this. I didn't really play a lot with those applications, but I don't like them. And this is my personal opinion. In my opinion, it's kind of like there's quite a steep learning curve to know the applications, and they are not helping that much. But again, this is my opinion. You could check them out. There are, I believe, some people who like them. Also, there are sometimes legal requirements why you want to use the applications and so on. And the most famous one are again from Microsoft threat modeling tool, and also a pretty famous one is Threat Modeler, and kind of new product, OWASP Threat Dragon. So this one is the only one I believe which is actually free. But it's in an incubator state, I believe, right now. Like, if you know what that means in terms of OWASP, it means it's very immature, lacking functionality, and so on. It has some potential, but as a threat modeling application. But again, I don't like the concept of threat modeling applications. So yeah, that's just my my personal view. All right, so what we actually did in Ocado, because as I said, I don't like lists, I don't like tools. So we have came up with solution which I will never say is perfect, but works nevertheless. And we are actually doing some threat modeling, and that's a lot to say comparing to a lot of companies. So I would say that that's pretty good. And our approach was driven by two main how would you say it, like we had two main goals. First of them, it was supposed to be fun and engaging. Why? Because AppSec team in Ocado is small. We are again in a great position because we actually have AppSec team, but it's pretty small. We can do threat modeling for everyone in Ocado. We had a huge number of developers here, and we want developers to do threat modeling by themselves. But in order to do that, they can't get bored, can't think of the process as a waste of time. So fun and engaging as much as possible. I'm, by the way, very much I like the concept of fun, of gamification, and things like this. I probably not everyone would agree with me, but my opinion is that if you make something fun, then everybody will be using this thing. Like automatically, you won't need to force them to do some things. So that's kind of how I look at this. So fun, engaging, and as simple as possible. Because again, for example, let's take tools like these threat modeling tools. We need to learn how these tools work. And for example, let's say I learned how the tool works. It took me like a week, but okay, I know it now. And I could do threat modeling for everyone. But again, that's not how we wanted to run it in Ocado. So we needed like a very easy, like quick start for people in order to start this process and to be able to do this themselves. That's also why we, for example, are not actually drawing system diagrams in any tool whatsoever. We are using just whiteboards because it's simple, it's quick. And that's why we are not storing the results in some fancy databases. We are using Google Sheets because it's easy and quick. And that's something we're aiming for. And this is the solution we came up with. I mean, we haven't actually came up with the solution, but because the solution was there, but we used it. And this is the cornucopia approach, I would say. Elevation of Privilege is actually a predecessor of cornucopia. So it's a card game by Microsoft, so for threat modeling. And cornucopia is kind of an open source version of it. I haven't played Elevation of Privilege. It seems very similar. I think in some ways it is even a little bit better than Cornucopia. So if you don't want to play in Cornucopia, then maybe check out the Elevation of Privilege. But I will be talking about Cornucopia. We will be using Cornucopia today because we chose Cornucopia. And yeah, so live demo, because you want to know how Cornucopia works. And actually, I never did this before. And if you think that demos are problematic because they can fail and so on, it gets even better, because we'll do this demo together, hopefully. So we'll try to kind of play in Cornucopia, although some caveats do apply, unfortunately, because we can't really play in Cornucopia, we can't really play cards. So we won't be drawing any diagram, system diagram. I have this prepared on the previous slide. We'll come back to it in a moment. We won't be playing a game. We'll be just going through cards. But that's all right, actually, because the game itself, like the game rules, are super simple. They're kind of similar to Hearts. So it's super easy to just learn how the game works. The more like part which causes problems is actually the cards themselves. And we would need to keep the discussions quick. I wasn't as fast as I hoped I will be. We do have some time, but probably we won't have like unlimited time to discuss about all the problems. And we'll do very quick assessment of found threads. So the basic idea is pick, maybe pick. We'll start with pre-prepared cards, then maybe move on to actually pick random cards. Very quick brainstorming about the card which will be presented. Very quick risk calculation, and maybe propose mitigations, and move on to the next one. Again, this is just so you more or less understand how this process works. And by the way, I really do hope that I'll get you engagement, because it all depends on you, and we'll see how it works. We have like a lot of gadgets to hand out to people who participate, like obviously shirts, like shopping bags, like some funny balls, and actually 2 cornucopia decks, thanks to OWASP. So you will be able to pick things at the end. Obviously, the first people who will engage will have the first picks. So we'll do like the handout after this. But yeah, please work with me, and we'll see how it goes. So very quickly about the application will be threat modeling, because we need to have application. We are threat modeling. So I took like the most simple I could think of. So this is the e-commerce, just because everyone knows how e-commerce works, right? So you have like trolley and probably like a checkout and credit cards and data and so on. I think most of you have some idea. Just for fun, there are like 3 main actors who are participating. So there is a customer who is using the shop. There is a retailer who has direct access to backend service, and all of this runs in some kind of a cloud. So there is like cloud admin who also have access to some things. The application itself has a load balancer. It has microservices, so simple front-end microservice with multiple instances, which does like trivial work, and backend service, which possibly does some more calculation-intense work. Some caching, some storage, and that's more or less it. We'll make some assumptions along the way, but I don't want to spend too much time here. By the way, these dotted lines represent so-called threat boundaries. Threat boundary groups systems or components which consider themselves trusted, right? So for example, you can, for example, if it would be Amazon, if you are familiar with Amazon, it would be similar to security group, right? So if all the services are in one security group, they can kind of trust themselves, but they definitely don't trust anything which comes to them from the internet. And yeah, so the last thing, black arrows. Arrows are communication, obviously. Black are HTTPS, and red are insecure, which is HTTP. And This could be much more detailed, but never mind. And let's say we're playing now. So this is the first card we actually drawn. Sebastian can easily identify usernames or can enumerate them. Cornucopia has like 6 suits. This suit is called authentication. The card number is 4. Just for the record, if you ever played Cornucopia, these are super helpful. Sometimes, and you will see this can save your life if you are doing this, especially for the first time, if you don't recognize the card. So, okay, please raise your hand. We have mics, and any ideas on how this card, how this thread, which is described there, could apply to the application we are having?
Well, you expect me to analyze if the risk is if there is a risk related to identify usernames, right? For example, if username are simple to guess, someone might try to lock all of them by using insecure passwords. So that would be a risk related to identifying usernames. So
how would you
kind of
come again?
denial of service attack.
Okay. Okay, I think that's also what you had in mind, right? Like, so my point is that measuring the time, this is one way of how to do it where you actually are doing it during logging time, right? The assumption is that if the user exists, then somehow you will learn how to somehow you learn that. Yeah. Okay.
Well,
Okay.
it's easy if the this depends of error message. If the error message says the password is incorrect and the user is incorrect, so you can easily determine if the username was correct or not.
Yeah, great. All right. So let's say that actually we do have this problem. So like the simpler version. I mean, the timing attack is obviously pretty cool, but let's say we have a simple version. So if you provide a login which is not in the database, then the message is login incorrect. But if the login is in the database, then the message is error message is password incorrect. So you can enumerate users, right? And let's focus on that. So the next step would be risk assessment. So let's do this Ocado way, which is like the most simple way possible. We are usually scoring from 0 to 5 impact and likelihood, and multiplying them. So what would be the impact of this?
Well, someone tries to impersonate user to perform some kind of phishing attack.
Right. So, but that's the attack you would carry on with, and that's very much correct. But you are talking about like the real impact. So, what actually could happen? I mean, that's kind of obvious, but kind of to say this out loud, what could happen because of the phishing attack?
Well, someone will be I don't know, forced to spend some money the way they wouldn't like to do, or to perform some other actions they wouldn't like to do. For example, the password may be stolen easily because they will given a mail that do something on our web page because you need to change your password, right?
Right. So the real impact is customer loses control over his account, right? I would put it this way. And by the way, this is like a pro tip if you are working in security. If you put it in words, don't ever do this yourself, because you are thinking in terms of security. And when, for example, 2 weeks later, developers and product owner will see your suggestion and descriptions and so on, then might not understand what actually you had in mind, because you will be kind of talking in another language. So make developers write this down in their words. That's kind of a pro tip. So okay, this is the impact. How would you rate it? Like in term, like impact in terms of the scale 0 to 5. Come on, guys.
Maybe 3.
3.
Start with something.
3. I heard once that you use 3 if you want to use 4, but you are too afraid. But because it's like a safe number, you can always
safe to start with, because you can go higher or lower. Yeah. Depends what shows next.
That's actually a great comment. So this is like a relative scale, and it's pretty important to know what's the worst thing to you in order to score everything else, right? So how bad for you is losing one customer? Maybe it's 3, maybe it's 5, and maybe you can't imagine anything worse happening. Well, let's say 3. Any other guesses? That's correct, right? If it's a retailer account, although I would say, I mean, that retailers are actually using different login form, and possibly they don't have this problem. But yeah, definitely, that's true.
Well, it's knowing the usernames is maybe not so useful, but it's a knowledge to mount some other kind of attack.
If you are thinking about impact, the rule of thumb is you are thinking about the worst possible impact. So yeah, the phishing attack might not work, but you should take it into account when talking about impact, that a customer actually loses password and the control of this account. All right, move on. Sorry, but I'll need to speed this a little bit. Likelihood. How likely is, and this is actually the part before we were ignoring if actually users will be phished or not, but now we are not. So how likely it is that this impact could happen?
It depends on the implementation. If there are some mistakes that will make it easier, likelihood is very probable. If everything is secure, the likelihood is much.
Well, we are agreed that the error messages are different. So you have this vulnerability. Now, how likely, when you know that you have this vulnerability, user enumeration, is that the impact, which is stealing someone's account, will happen?
Well, I'd say pretty high. If a login name is a password, is an email, it's a valuable thing to have. Because it's easy to do.
Yeah. Right. Well, we kind of want to record this, so please try to use mics. That's kind of my personal request. But coming back to you, that's actually both very valid points. First of them is that likelihood is not as simple as impact. So likelihood is about, for example, how easy it is to find this vulnerability if you are a hacker. Likelihood is about how easy it is to exploit this vulnerability if you are a hacker. Likelihood is also about, if I am a hacker and I'm trying to exploit your application, is this something worth my time to play this kind of a game, which is enumerating usernames and so on? How much money will I get for doing that? Because in this case, maybe not that much. So yeah, that's very true. As for assuming the likelihood is very high, we are usually taking the worst possible impact, but likelihood, at least that's our approach. We try to have as realistic as possible, because I mean, it wouldn't be very helpful if we would end up with a list of 30 threats and all of them would be scored maximum. So we still didn't do the prioritization part, right? Okay, so let's say we agreed on some numbers. Let's move on. Oh, but sorry, one more thing. Maybe we'll be skipping some parts of this later. But how would you mitigate it? What are the solutions?
Kill Sebastian.
That's one mitigation. Not really very much legal, but definitely one of them.
Well, change the error messages, add some captcha on the login page.
Right,
Methods.
right, and that's what I wanted to hear, because then I'd like to remember that I want you to remember that you have also like password reset functionality, where usually user enumeration is also a problem, or even worse, almost every page in the world have this problem in new account creation. But nevertheless, let's carry on. So this is session management, another card, another suit. Jeff can resend an identical repeat interaction, for example, HTTP request, signal, button press, and it is accepted, not rejected. First of all, do you actually understand this card? And do you think it's applicable to our system? And if so, where? Right, right. But it depends. You don't want to repeat your actions, because then you will be just only buying the same thing twice. You still would need to kind of pay for this, right? I mean, it depends. Maybe you found some way on how to do this without paying, but yeah, I mean, again, we will be we will have some problems, because we are talking about theoretical application, which isn't like super well defined. But all right, this card mostly talks, not only but mostly, about so-called replay attacks. Do you know what replay attacks are? Who doesn't know what replay attacks are? Okay, so if you have man in the middle, then you could sometimes modify the traffic which comes through you, but sometimes all you can do is just get the traffic and possibly send it further, but you can't modify it inside, right? So this is a replay attack. You don't have any control over the content, but you could send the same request twice. Like the rule in thumb here is that HTTPS is not vulnerable to replay attacks, but HTTP is. So with that information in mind, do you have some other ideas?
Considering that the front-end services are protected by HTTPS, this application should be not vulnerable to replay attacks in terms of third, fourth layer of OC model, but maybe it will be some kind of attack approaches on the higher levels. Let's say that somebody initiates the financial transaction, yeah, and he's replaying the traffic, assuming that he can impersonate other customer.
Yep, that's correct.
Or I don't know if we consider it, but actually admin has direct access to SQL. It can be sometimes F5 pressed twice, and it can
you should definitely consider that.
The data.
That's why the admin is there, because you're looking at the whole picture. So admin is mostly trusted, right? It's like it's Amazon AWS or Google Cloud admin.
He's not trusted because he's behind the dotted lines.
Yeah, I mean, he's in the cloud, but he's outside of our trust boundary. So you need to take care of this as well.
Also, retailer is communicating with the backend service directly.
Yeah.
Through HTTP, right?
HTTPS. Sorry, I know it's confusing. I was trying to decide the colors, but red means insecure, which is HTTP.
Okay.
But I know it's not great, but sorry. I didn't want to put labels on every arrow because it would just make a mess of this picture. Let's carry on. Let's skip risk assessment here. And this is a fun one. So Kelly can bypass authorization controls because they do not fall securely. They default to allowing access. And any ideas of how could this happen? This is authorization.
Retailer may fail identifying. Maybe retailer could fail identifying itself and gain access to some kind of services he shouldn't get access to.
Meaning what kind of service?
Well, if it's I don't know, but I assume it's a kind of API from retailer to backend service, not a user interface.
Yep.
So it's a API. So there is a possibility that I don't know, missing some API key or something like that will make action to happen because authorization failed, but action was performed.
That's
For
actually,
example, it's a
I think I
API.
know what you mean, and that's actually another card, which is not here, but there is card like this in Cornucopia. And usually when I have this scenario during the game that actually someone comes with the idea of an attack which is on another card, but not on the particular we are playing right now, I tend to not wait for the card, but just count it as a valid issue, because no matter how you came to this thread, this is a valid thread. That's how I do this. But yeah, okay.
If you use blacklist instead of whitelist.
Exactly. That's probably the most common approach. I mean, not the most common problem with that. If you are actually if you are creating endpoint and are using blacklist, so for example, this role can access this endpoint and this role can access this endpoint, and then you add another role, but you forgot to update your blacklists, then you are vulnerable. Exactly. Also, another thing which is quite similar is if, for example, as in Java, you are working with annotations. So, like, for example, you have this controller class, and you need to put an annotation that this particular role can access this controller. What would happen if you forgot to add the annotation? Because in most cases, unfortunately, this would default to granting access, and you want to make sure that if you forgot to put an annotation in place, this will actually deny access. Let's carry on for a minute. This is the fun one. So Owen can access, possibly. I mean, the names here are pretty funny sometimes, and apparently there are names of OWASP members. From what I read, but never mind. Owen possibly can access stored business data, for example, passwords, session identifiers, PIIs, cardholder data, because it is not securely encrypted or securely hashed. And for example, you know that we are storing some kind of user passwords, obviously, and developers has assured you that you are using very secure, just released SHA-3 functions. These are just published. So what are your thoughts on that? This is a tricky question. Come on, any guesses?
Definitely, the biggest threat will be admin, of course, the bad admin scenario that he can, for example, by mistake copy, let's say, passwords database, yeah, or not by mistake, or any internal attacker.
Right, but why? Because I think we kind of agree.
Of course,
know what we
as
mean.
usual, it depends. But let's say that somebody was able to break the boundaries, the threat boundaries, and he's acting as an internal attacker with access to the password database. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what I wanted to know is why. I mean, it's the problem as like the point of this card is we should be storing securely those credentials. So even if someone stalls those credentials, they can't do much about them. And Well, this was a little bit tricky because Tomek didn't say that aloud, but if you pay attention to his slides, SHA-3 is indeed just released. I mean, it's a couple years old, but it's a very fresh hashing algorithm, but it's a fast general purpose hashing algorithm. So you can't really say that this is secure and that you are not vulnerable to the threat because you are using fast hashing algorithm to store passwords. We are almost out of time.
Well,
yep.
The important thing to the is that the likelihood is probably low, so it requires some other leak or data or something like that.
Definitely, or as Wojtek previously said, maybe admin by mistake or on purpose did something wrong. But yeah, the likelihood is rather small. I would agree. I'm sorry we're not doing this likelihood assessment, this impact likelihood assessment, but it takes quite a lot of time, and we are very much out of time. So that's also, I think. I think, unfortunately, we need to skip this. The rest of the cards. You can read all the cards, by the way, on OWASP. Obviously, it's an open source project, so you can read through the cards and think about these examples in terms of this application yourself as an exercise if you want to. But right now, we need to keep going. And because we need to kind of answer the question, was it worth it to have this threat modeling effort? And this is my opinion, so it was super worth it. And well, 10 out of 10 maybe it's not about like the process itself, but about the idea. The idea of threat modeling, I think, is the most important. It is the single most important activity in terms of security, meaning like it's maybe doesn't give you like super great impact in terms of security, but because of threat modeling, you can create a lot of impact later on after you have a threat model. But nothing is perfect, and neither is threat modeling. There are some challenges we had, and they are pretty big one. I'm not gonna lie to you. The first of them is time. It takes a lot of time. Playing through cornucopia decks, there's 6 times 13 cards, so a lot, and it takes hours. And when I say hours, it could take even more than a day of your work, like more than 8 hours. It depends, because like quickly playing the cards isn't really time consuming. It would take like maybe 30 minutes or so, but depends on the discussions. Thank you very much for your engagement. It was quite good, but I still knew that you won't be as engaged as we are in smaller groups when we are doing threat modeling. And at the beginning, everybody is a bit shy and they don't want to say something stupid and so on. But as the time progresses, people are starting to engage a lot. And these discussions are great because they are learning very much. But at the same time, they take time. So it's not like super uncommon to talk about one card for like 20, 30, 40 minutes. Because developers just want to talk. And at the beginning, you are kind of getting to know the application, the rules, and so on and so on. So again, a lot of hours this process can take. And what are the solutions? Well, you can't really shorten this up. I mean, you can. We are doing this in Ocado because it's better to do something quicker than don't do this at all. But unfortunately, this is how it will look like. My advices are, first of all, act. If you don't have a feeling of accomplishment at the end of the process, then you just think that you wasted your time. Spending 8 hours on something which is valuable and meaningful is not that bad. Spending 8 hours on something which is pointless because it will be ignored is very bad. So remember to act after threat modeling. Also, don't overdo the conversations. Developers are usually like to talk, so this kind of they like to talk, and some conversations are going for too long. Some moderation is required. Well, and again, sometimes you can kind of find solutions which are quicker and not as thorough. So, for example, maybe one proposed solution, which we are actually not doing right now, but was for maybe at each stand-up, you will just play one card and talk about this one card. Then after like half a year, but still you will get to the point when you will talk through about all of the deck and so on. So the process is like very much long, and it's not ideal, but it's better to do this way than don't do threat modeling at all. Also, this is hard work, and after a meeting which takes like 3 hours, everybody's exhausted. I actually thought that people will be bored, but they are not bored at all. And on the other hand, they are exhausted, especially if the room is small, the air, and so on. What are my advices? Split the game for like 2, 3, 4 meetings. Don't hold like 1 8-hour meeting because you will kill people. Also, if you can do that, pizza, beers, cookies, some rewards. This is a game, so someone will win. So maybe some kind of reward for the guy or a girl, obviously. You could use this. Yep.
You've missed the one important thing. It says is a game. A game are about winning and losing. What are the winning criteria? The who gets who proposed the best vulnerability gets the card. How does it work?
So again, we weren't talking about the game rules because they're not that important and are pretty easy. Generally, there are points, and points are for winning like the card part of the game, and also you get a point for every identified threat. So at the end, the person who has the most points wins. Simple enough. So again, we are almost every time providing pizza to our developers just because we want to keep them in the room and want to keep them playing. So yeah. Also, maybe don't invite everyone to this threat modeling. So if you have this technical part, don't invite product owners or people who are not technical because they will be bored. And simplify this as much as possible. This is like my general approach. And immature processes, this is also, again, I'm not saying we are doing like a perfect threat modeling in Ocado, but that's also because we are learning along the way, because there's not much resources about this. And this is a problem, but this is why we started it, and we are doing this, even though we know we are making mistakes along the way, but we are learning. And in number of years, it does look better now than it used to, and hopefully with time it will be closer to being perfect. Also about cornucopia, very quickly, but you need to kind of be with your developers at the beginning, because some of cornucopia cards are, sorry, but terrible. I mean, 5 of authorization. Chat can access resources including services, processes, AJAX, Flash, video, images, documents, temporary files, session data, system properties, configuration data, registry settings, logs. I mean, I've lost you like a minute before ago, right? And it's even worse here. Leak and bypass application controls because dangerous, risky programming language functions have been used instead of safer alternatives, or there are type conversion errors, or because the application is unreliable when an external resource is unavailable, or there are race conditions, and so on. I think you see the point. I think what cornucopia guys wanted to achieve was to make sure that you will think about everything. And I agree kind of with this reasoning, but this is the result. And every time this kind of cards, and there's a lot of examples of similar cards, I to pick like the worst ones, but there's a lot of examples of such cards in the deck, and every time this card is being read out loud, well, everybody drifts apart, right?
One question, could you please clarify what are those underneath on the bottom of the card, these IDs?
I will in a minute, don't worry. But let's skip because it kind of connects well with my two next slides. So again, we have two cards which are, in my opinion, not perfect. So run can influence or alter authorization controls and permissions and can therefore bypass them. And Dinis has the same kind of control, but in terms of data validation and encoding. And raise your hand if you know what they are talking about. Exactly. And I mean, everybody's kind of like trying to figure out what does it mean? Because how can actually they can influence authorization controls? They would need to kind of write the source code. So are we talking about our developers? Well, if you read about this, it turns out that it's actually pretty simple. This talks about client-side controls. So for example, if you do data validation in your JavaScript, okay, great. So I actually was disconnected from the Hangout. Tomasz, could you try to reconnect and I will talk? If the data validation is done client side in JavaScript, then obviously the person who is like a user can influence this, meaning they can rewrite the JavaScript in the browser, right? If I mean, you probably heard about like logging being done in JavaScript. This happens pretty rarely, but it does happen. And the point I'm trying to make is, if they would wrote that this is about bypassing JavaScript controls, everybody would know what they are talking about on these cards, right? But the wording is pretty much like it is problematic. Oh, it's actually working. I'll do it. Right, thank you. And okay, so finally, these are like the worst cards I found in the deck. So Larry can influence the trust other parties, including users, have in the application, or abuse the trust elsewhere. Who has any idea what this card is talking about? Yeah. I mean, that was me when I first wrote the card. And this one is even better. I mean, I love this. Paulo can access data in transit that is not encrypted, even though the channel is encrypted. What does it mean? Okay, so you have at least some ideas, and I'm not saying they're bad, because whatever you come out with about playing cornucopia cards is good, but as Tomek said, there are these like things at the bottom. As you can see, there are like great resources like OWASP SCP or OWASP ASVS. Absence are actually, I've never checked absence, but there's CAPEC, there's SafeCode. And whenever you find a card which you don't really know what the card is talking about, go look this up and you will find some more explanation. And quite often, the card will be clear. So apparently, this one is about phishing. So if you are doing some things which are promoting bad practices, like, for example, you are sending links for user to click in emails, then you are making it easier to phish your customers. And this is what this card is talking about. It also is about Clickjacking. I'm not exactly sure why, but that's the case. But mostly phishing.
So I think for like the 5 might be a good guess for watering hole attack. So if you can influence other applications and the trust that will establish in that, like the KNF problem that we had a couple of years ago.
Again, what we will get from the card is always a good result. I'm just saying what the authors had in mind, and I would never guess this about phishing. And this one, believe it or not side channels attack, but so this is about sending stuff through encrypted channel, which is not encrypted, which you would thought that why would you encrypt things twice? And this one actually is called the like KPEG 185 186 and 187. English is hard, sorry. Are malicious automated software update, malicious software update, malicious software download. So the point is you are kind of switching the application on the server side, and even though we are using encrypted channel to download this application, it wasn't, for example, signed, so you still end up being attacked somehow. And why would they use these words? I have no idea. But I don't want to be pessimistic. I mean, it's like, you know, like marriage, I guess, like good marriage. So I spend a lot of time playing Cornucopia, really a lot of time. So I know about a lot of bad things about Cornucopia because I kind of lived through them. But at the same time, I really love the idea of threat modeling. And still, this is the best approach we actually found. And to this day, I haven't found any approach which is better. In my opinion, at least. I mean, obviously, you could disagree, but again. So my overall verdict, again, I really do recommend threat modeling. Maybe the Cornucopia is not for you, but it's definitely better than, again, running as a headless chicken. Do a threat modeling first. And
free to use, free to join. Why don't you propose new descriptions for the cards?
Yeah, it was suggested to me, and I actually was thinking about it pretty hard. Well, busy, I guess. I mean, yeah, that's not an excuse, but that's probably a discussion for later. I didn't have time for this, but yeah. Which, yeah, that's a yeah. How is Ocado doing? Again, I'm kind of like self high-fiving ourselves because, again, I'm not saying it's perfect. It's far from perfect. But we are doing something. And when I talk to people, I don't see a lot of effort in threat modeling overall. So just doing something, learning about more along the way, and so on, in my opinion, is already a huge success. And if you want to take something from this presentation, that would probably be it. Start doing this. Just start doing this, right? And it won't probably look perfect at the beginning, but you will get there eventually. And yeah, if you ever seen one of my presentations, there's like usually like a huge list of links here. Unfortunately, I can't really recommend any link here. I mean, just Google Cornucopia if you want to know how to play in Cornucopia. Just Google Elevation of Privilege if you want to learn how to play Elevation of Privilege. But there is not like a untypical resource you wouldn't find yourself, which I would really, really recommend because it's like a mind-blowing and revelation. And that's it. I will happy answer questions, although we are a little bit after time, so hopefully you won't have as many of them. But if you have any, then I'll be happy. Yep.
I have one in Ocado. Where the threat modeling sits in your in the pipeline. So do you do this regularly, or you tend rather to assess, let's say, most of the changes, major changes to your systems, because it's quite important. Because some defects might leak to production easily if you don't do this.
That's also a very important question, and unfortunately, it's also a long answer. But basically, keeping it really simple, right now we are mostly doing this with all of the teams. We started this around 2 years ago, and we have a lot of products in Ocado, and these products were created like in 2002 or something. So obviously we have a lot of catching up, and we are somewhere there, catching up with all. We want to achieve the point where each of our application is like threat modeled initially, and then, which we are unfortunately aren't doing right now, but we are planning to, is to introduce this threat modeling so-called incrementally. And this is a like huge challenge, because I told you that cornucopia game takes like 8 hours, let's say, like playing through whole deck. So you can't really spend 8 hours of the whole team time every sprint. That's not gonna happen, really. So there are challenges, and I don't have any like concrete answer. We have some ideas, but because it's a not widespread thing we are doing right now, there are still ideas, and we need to battle test them ourselves. But it is very important to threat model things regularly, because your applications are usually changing, and therefore threat models are. Right. I think that's it.
Yeah, I think that also if you took part in any of this, just come for gadgets, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if you took part, as promised, there will be gadgets. I more or less remember who that was, so you might try and cheat, but we'll see if that works. Yeah, and thank you. How much time do we have to leave?